Graph connector for LogicMonitor. And that means a lot. Where this whole kind of effort came from is that ServiceNow recognized that as custom integrations get built into their ecosystem, this can cause a lot of complications. Since integrations don't have kind of a model to follow as they come in, they're able to identify what data they have and put it into whatever classes they decide within the CMDB. Similar to how we did it with the LM CMDB application. But what this does is it causes additional complexity within the CMDB class model tables. It can also cause poor performance as additional fields are added to tables unexpectedly. And it can also cause a loss of data integrity within the CMDB if multiple integrations are pushing in incorrect data or not properly aligning with the CMDB CI class models. So what ServiceNow decided to do was they wanted to push integrations to use their robust transformation engine and their identification and reconciliation engine to better have integrations align with CMDB class information. They wanted to push this out with the last major release of Orlando. But overall, it was an uphill battle trying to get integrations to kind of raise their entire applications to the ground, rebuild from scratch, and use these new methodologies. They also found that usage of the RTE and IRE were slowed by just the complexity of how they work. So it also gave the ServiceNow a chance to push an additional product called the Integration Hub ETL, which we'll cover a little bit later. So along with this, since their adoption was so slow, ServiceNow decided to partner with specific integrations to update to these new methodologies with a sort of pushing for a September rollout, as well as an expectation for integrations beyond that point to update to these new methodologies as well. So what changed in our application? Apart from the name is a big deal for ServiceNow. Our integration is a part of what they consider their service graph ecosystem. So partnered integrations are all following the same naming convention to be service graph connectors for a particular integration. So that's part of where that name change comes in. It also required us to completely separate ourselves from our existing application, since this is a new named application with a new namespace and a new listing. That name change kind of separates us from our V1 application a little bit more. Some of the main things that I'll kind of show through this demo is the new inbound pipeline, where we were using import sets, transform maps, and kind of those standard service model paradigms that have been used for quite a while. The new model uses data sources, robust transformations, as well as the identification and reconciliation engine to properly map incoming LogicMonitor data to CMDB CI classes within the system. This includes ServiceNow approved class mappings. We had to go through a number of exercises with ServiceNow to make sure that the data we pull in from LogicMonitor is being properly mapped to CI classes. And this includes subclasses in the cases of, say, VM instances that might have data centers, or that have to have data centers attached, as well as cloud service accounts. We do need to fulfill those extending class model expectations. We also have a new UI-based guided setup to have a more streamlined customer setup experience. And this is another ServiceNow mandatory requirement. They want all Service Graph connectors, as well as ServiceNow standard applications, to follow these kind of guided setup to ease customers into usage of your integration. We use the Integration Hub ETL application, like I mentioned before, and the new RTE IRE mechanisms, including better mapping from LogicMonitor data to the CMDB fields. We have also decoupled LogicMonitor data from the CMDB classes. And what this means is we were originally putting all of our LogicMonitor data onto the actual CMDB tables as additional class field extensions. This is what I mentioned earlier as being a pain point for ServiceNow, because as we extend from their existing objects and kind of try to shove our data in there, that's where it's kind of causing complexity within ServiceNow and causing slowdown for users of the system. So since we have decoupled our LogicMonitor data from those CMDB classes, and we are no longer using custom relationships or class field extensions, this kind of makes our overall product moving forward a little bit more performant and more stable. We've also migrated all of the web calls away from business rules to scheduled executions. This is to prevent massive numbers of updates to existing ServiceNow data, causing a large backlog of items that need to be processed in a web queue. So this will be something I'll go over a little bit later, but most of this is more in terms of getting to more performant APIs and an object-driven methodology versus our pre-existing application, which was a lot more heavily scripted. And again, this is ServiceNow really trying to get integrations to line up with what they expect for an object model and a usage pattern. So with that out of the way, we'll take a look at what Service Graph Connector actually looks like now. So the first thing that the user will be presented is the guided setup. And this is ServiceNow's big expectation on how integrations are going to start, or customers are going to start to use integrations. You may have seen these on existing ServiceNow applications, and most of this is identical to how we would have set up the original application, just with a slightly more driven UI. So we are able to actually separate down all of our individual steps for setting up the application, and we can kind of walk the user through that experience. So just to get started, we can walk into configuring the connection. And you can already see here that this help bar pops out. We have additional actions for marking this step as complete, as well as getting back to the guided setup. These help panels are also attached to these steps, so we can fill these with whatever embedded help we need to assist the customer in setting up their application. So the first thing any user needs to set up is a connection and a credential with their LogicMonitor portal. So what I'll do here is we will connect over to a user that I have set up on my portal. This uses the same API token and access key that we use in the existing application. It just looks a little bit different in terms of the UI, but we can enter that information, and we now have a LogicMonitor API connection, which is set up as an HTTP connection and includes that credential. This is important to note because this is all alias based. We are able to set up multiple API connections, which is considerably different from the first application where we were tied into a single LogicMonitor instance per CMDB. In this case, we are able to, since we're able to specify both our host as well as the credential, we're able to set up multiple LogicMonitor APIs, also giving them rollovers, overrides, usage of mid-server support in case of firewalls or anything that we're going to need to get around. And it also allows us to do multiple portals within the same CMDB. So having that connection set up, we'll mark that as complete. And we can now move on to the next step, which is doing a load test of our data. So this brings us to our data source. This is a data source specifically for the collector list. Previously, we were doing this all through scheduled script executions where we were using a script to go out to the LogicMonitor API. In this case specifically, we are using a built-in REST type data source. So this includes a lot of nice functionality where we can actually parse the JSON that comes back. We have support for pagination, including limits and offsets. And it also ties into ServiceNow's backend REST mechanisms. So we do also have some limited support for rate limiting and retries. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to test load 20 records. What this does is this gives us a chance to see if that connection and credential we set up is properly working. And we can see that it is. It processed one record and made one insert. And we can see our loaded data, created a set. And within that set, we should have one row. And we can move back to our guided setup and mark that as complete. So now we know that we can pull data into the ServiceNow system. We need to be able to do something with that data. In the original system, we took our data from our scripts, we placed it into a staging table as an import set, and then we used a combination of transform maps and general scripting to get that data from LogicMonitor fields to ServiceNow fields. Now in the new system, because of the complexity around the robust transformation engine and the shift away from import sets and transform maps, the ServiceNow has pushed this product called Integration Hub ETL. And what this is this is a quick way to get your data source information usable and mappable to your CMDB instances. So in our case, we took a look at the collector list as part of that overall test. So we can see here that LM collector list data source. We can also see that it's tied to a schedule, which is where our scheduled data imports come in. These are identical to the existing scheduled jobs that we have. However, it does not run a script. It runs that data source, but it does come out of the box set as disabled and can be set to run on a period as needed by the customer. So this is 100% flexible. Along with that, we will click into here to see the actual import mechanisms. And actually, I will swap over to a different instance to show this a little better where we have more data. The ETL steps are taking the import set data that we pulled in via our data source and preparing that information for mapping. So here we can see the basic scenario for what data source we want to map, what import set we want to use against it, as well as the general application and naming. We are then able to take a look into what data was pulled in via that update set. So we can see we can see all of the fields that LogicMonitor is currently pulling in. That's because we are using a stringified JSON, this UI does get extended a little bit. You can see here that for LogicMonitor's hierarchical data, which is not currently supported by ServiceNow, we are forced to flatten that data into a single string and then parse it out as needed. So under a lot of these fields, you can see that they have a script operation. And those script operations perform a transformation to be able to pull a single source property out of that JSON and align it with a column such that we can use it in the next set of mapping. You can also see here that we have this concept of a native key. This comes into part of ServiceNow's overall IRE and RTE experience, where information that's coming from an integration needs to have a globally unique identifier. And ServiceNow's expectation is to make that as globally unique as possible, such in the case of a ServiceNow instance using, say, multiple LogicMonitor integrations or multiple integrations that may have the same hardware data or instance data. The native key allows you to specifically match your integrations data with the CMDB CI record. So in our case, we were originally using just the LM resource ID, which is just this little 4 here on the end. To make this even more globally unique, we've added the type as well as the LogicMonitor portal that this is extending from. This is key here for anyone who has used the ServiceNow integration with multiple portals. If you imported the same devices or collectors with matching IDs, they would end up with collisions. But now, since we are making these more globally unique, we are able to host multiple LogicMonitor instance data within the same CMDB. And so you'll see this kind of pattern showing up in quite a few different places, whether that's related IDs to match to other relationships, or whether that's on the collector to collector group or collector to resources. So once we have prepped and previewed our data, we can then actually.
Can I ask a question right there? So
sure.
That view previewing and that data, how often do customers will come to this view to check and make sure, and then mark that step complete? Not because it's right now it looks huge, right? You have to scroll up and down and left
right.
and right and steps.
So as far as this goes, and there is a little bit more that you can do to actually kind of make this UI a little bit better. We found that just even rearranging a lot of this and taking off certain columns will make the UI resize. So if you take off like those all properties, any of the stringified JSON, this collapses a lot better. But anytime the customer would have made changes and customizations to their import sets and transformation maps, this is where they would be doing it instead. They would be doing it within this IHETL process. So where they would have changed import sets, they would be doing it in this prepare source data, and where they would have been changing transform maps, they would be doing it in this mapping data set.
Awesome. Okay, cool.
So if we go into mapping the data, we can see kind of what the transformation maps were doing in the original application. We were taking data from LM, looking at its specific source sysclass name, determining what type of class we wanted to put it into within the CMDB, and then mapping those individual fields. So if we take a look into computer, we can see here all of the source data columns from the data that we've mapped via that import set, as well as all the transformed columns where we're pulling those data fields out of the JSON via script. All of these are pill-based and can be dragged and dropped over to the mapping on the left to specifically apply them, or they're all selectable via drop-downs next to any of these fields. These can also be these transform columns can also take multiple inputs. So in cases where we need to aggregate data to form an ID, we're able to do that via the scripts and transformed columns. But this is ServiceNow's means to get integrations, an easier way to work with transformations. Where transform maps were heavily based on individual table fields and rows and entries, this GUI-based approach has seemed to get integrations quicker to mapping and give customers an easier time customizing what integrations they use. So in cases where we may have a customer who needs an additional set of data coming out of that JSON property that either they have specified or would like to have in their ServiceNow instance, then they're able to change those transform columns and map them as they want. So what this also does, which was a pain point in the original version, is relationships. Relationships, we had originally been using custom relationships of monitored or monitored by, and part of the ServiceNow efforts in the new Service Graph ecosystem is to shift away from custom relationships, custom field extensions, and custom classes in general. There's a few cases where we do still use custom classes like the collectors and collector groups, which makes sense since they don't have a real logical representation within the CMDB. But we have switched to using out-of-the-box relationships, both for our uses with collectors and device relationships, as well as for the built-in relationships that we need to manage for CMDB CI classes. So in cases where you may have a computer, you may also need to specify what network adapters it has, which have specific objects for IP address and MAC address that all need relationships to be properly created. We can also see examples of this if we look into our collectors. We are adding relationships to make sure that collectors are members of collector groups. And we also, in cloud, cloud is probably one of the ones that changed the most because in the initial system that we were working on, we were mostly just using the VM instance, virtual machine instance class. We shoved most of our LM data into this class and kind of left it there. But this is one of the cases where ServiceNow wants to make sure that integrations are adhering to the full dependent classes mechanism. So for VM instances must also be tied to a data center. The data center must be tied to a cloud service account, and that VM instance must also have a virtualized computer instance. So this, where we were initially just creating a VM instance class in our first one, we are now creating a significant number of stub records along with it, as well as the relationships to match between them for the virtualized by for the computer, as well as the registered on back to the collector and the hosted on for both the data center as well as the cloud service account. So, and what does this look like? So now that we've gone through most of the setup and getting your data into the system, what does this actually look like? We no longer have any data on configuration items themselves. In the original application, you would come into your configuration item and you would see the LM resource ID, LM enable, LM update, all of the relevant fields that we were using. Since we have decoupled that LogicMonitor specific data into its own table, the CI record is out of the box clean. And this is the big thing that ServiceNow wants to get to, getting as much of custom data off of those objects as possible. But along with that, you can now see the relationships that that CI has, both with its collector groups as well as its collectors. Any other relationships will also populate here, and we'll see that with the VM instances. But this table specifically, where devices was originally showing CMDB CI records, it now shows our LogicMonitor device data table. Each configuration item record, when it gets associated with a LogicMonitor device, it doesn't get a standard relationship in the idea that you get a related item up here, but it is marked as a related data item such that the RTE and IRE background can link the two. So here we get an additional tab for LogicMonitor devices that are associated with this computer. And we can see here that it's LM resource ID 3260. It's a device and it came from my portal LM Nicholas Johnson. It's tied to that 0 collector group and it's managed by collector ID 0. And that's the data that we're seeing over on this table here, where we can see that LM ID is collector group ID, the enable flag, the update flag, as well as this new requires sync flag. Again, this is just the big effort to decouple as much of our custom data out of ServiceNow and into its own table. And we have similar tables for both the collectors as well as the collector groups. Collectors stayed mostly the same. They are a custom class extending off of application. And the collector groups, which were originally class field extensions on CMDB groups, collector groups are now a custom class extending directly off of CMDB CI. This gives us a little bit more freedom and gets us into a better place where CMDB groups were being used kind of incorrectly with the way we were doing them before. Again, with all of these, you do have a relationship here. You do have the same relationships on collectors and collector groups, such that you can see on this collector what it has registered for devices, as well as what groups it's a part of. We also carried over the assignment to collector and assignment to collector group functionality that came out of the auto balance collector group update set from the V1 application. So we do have assignment to both collectors and collector groups for devices. We'll take a look real quick at the VM instances here. And this is one of the big things that changed in terms of those relationships. You can also see specifically what data center it's applied to and what cloud service account it's applied to. Again, this is all linked as necessary up through each level of the CMDB classes, and we can see all those listed here. Some things that stayed the change. Most properties are still listed in properties. The only properties that have been moved out of here are things that are essential to the initial configuration, which is our LogicMonitor portal, as well as the API access ID and access key, which were moved to the guided setup. The remainder of the properties are non-critical to initial testing and setup, so they remained in this properties. But if we find that the customer experience prefers to have them in the guided setup does have mechanisms for migrating these properties over there. A few other things that you'll notice have changed. Based on ServiceNow expectations, certain things like scheduled jobs have new changes to import schedules, and some of this ordering will change as we go through the beta certification process. One of the main outbound changes that I want to make sure is addressed before I run out of time here, our outbound pipeline used to be controlled primarily by business rules. It still is. The business rules, however, in the V1 application had the entirety of our outbound REST calls. What happens with this is on cases where a CMDB CI record may update, a customer may have an experience where this filter condition, which happens on CMDB CI changes to description, IP address, or class, could potentially change thousands, hundreds of thousands of records. And these get triggered as business rules, so they're all triggered individually. What that was doing was it was creating a massive flood of transactions that needed to be processed, and web calls, since they have the potential to be rate limited or timeout based, it was causing massive disruptions to the business rule worker queues and overall pools. So ServiceNow's recommendation is that business rules will only have database and file-based I/O. So now these, instead of doing a web call, will simply mark that requires sync field to true that we saw previously here on our LM related data. This field is now used as a flag for a scheduled export of data out to LogicMonitor. Again, this gives flexibility to the end consumer to determine how often they want to be pushing this data out, and it batches all of those records to be processed as a single unit rather than filling up that business rule pool and allowing that to be a quicker queue and leaving our slower queue to our scheduled script execution. Apart from that, the majority of the application has feature parity to our V1 application. We have also submitted it up for beta certification. So it has passed its initial round of certification, though we do have a couple additional submissions to make based on feedback from that. But we have been cleared to progress into early customer betas with it, as well as get their feedback and continue shooting for that September deadline. So any questions on Service Graph Connector for LogicMonitor?
Hey, Nick, hey, first of all, great job. It's coming along really well, and I'm glad to see that ServiceNow folks have already engaged, and I guess they are officially certified, or there are still some steps remaining.
So we have gotten initial certification for customer beta. So ServiceNow is now expecting us to go through the store for all betas, which includes their beta certification. So they have done an initial review of that, enough that we can get it out to customers for trial. So they did provide some feedback, so we can't go to a general release without completing that feedback and going through the certification process. But ServiceNow has been incredibly engaged in making sure that we get this done, you know, as quickly as possible, since it is ultimately their timeline for September.
Yeah, and they're going to use this as their kind of their flagship partner program. They will try to use us as their referenceable customer. So the certification that we got last night, so that's as good as being in the store right now, but then it just it has the automated steps that checks like I don't know how many checks they make.
Okay, that's fine. So one question I had was, what happens to, I forget what it was called, the older integration? What's the plan for that?
So the older integration currently will be supported up through Paris. We received our Paris certification, an automated Paris certification last week. So the existing application will currently support New York through Paris. This application, the Service Graph Connector, we have a minimum version of Orlando Patch 5. That's the last or the first Orlando patch that ServiceNow is making the cut for to be as the minimum version. So we will have a little bit of version overlap between V1 and this V2 Service Graph Connector. But Service Graph Connector will be Orlando Patch 5 and onward. Currently, because of the split between how ServiceNow wanted us to do the new application versus the old application, there is not a clean upgrade path. And it will probably need to be handled on a case-by-case basis, dependent on what customizations the customer has employed and what additional kinds of data they have entered. Because of the way the IRE and RTE process works, there may be customers with setups where we can do a one-to-one upgrade path with an existing application. But it's currently an unknown, and customizations do make that an inherently tricky process. So as we get into the customer testing, we'll be able to kind of determine what that level of migration really looks like.
So what I would like to, and I don't know if Pavel is on the call as well, but basically I want to make sure that we are very clear in terms of, I guess, what our best practices are, what the migration steps are going to be, and also what is our end of life strategy for the older version of the app. Okay. I don't know whether that has all been sorted out, but I would like to see in fact, some documentation on our website. Hey, this is what's going to happen, because I can guarantee you there will be a few stragglers in the customer base. So we just need to be clear in terms of how we are going to handle that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thankfully having the V1 application having a little bit more longer end of life where we can push it, with through Orlando and technically into Paris, we do still have a nice runway for end of life for it.
Correct. But then even that, see, the one is giving people time to cross over. The other thing is that we need to set expectations about what we're going to do with the older app, right? We might say that, and this is something for the team to decide, but we might say that, hey, other than critical bug fixes, there are no more enhancements which are happening, as an example, right? So that's one aspect, is just overall managing the end of life, being transparent to the customers, what we expect them to do, etc. Then the second is, you kind of touched upon, is in which cases, and maybe it's not black and white, but in which cases would the upgrade be, I guess, painless? There'll probably be some manual intervention. So it's like really setting expectations. For example, I'm on Paris, whatever. I used to use the old app. What do you expect from me as a customer, right? So that information needs to be available. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe Pavel, is Pavel around?
Yeah. I'm here.
Yeah, so if you can just take that up, and then also it requires some coordination with the CSM team and maybe the sales team, I'm not sure, but at least for existing customer base. And then also we should set expectations for new ServiceNow installation. Perhaps we should just encourage or mandate that it is the new app only and not the older app, unless there's some version issue.
Yeah, Nitin, I think, sorry, I was just going to cut in. I think this is a really good point on making sure that customers that are currently on the older versions are aware, and we give them kind of a migration like timeline of when to get them into the new, versus having new customers come in too, and when they can start using this.
Yeah, and let's try to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
All of you know that this at least is guaranteed to blow up with 1 or 2 customers sometime down the line, 6 months down the line. Okay.
You're absolutely right, Pavel. We can work on this.
And parts of that is already in the process of. Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions?